Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the channel, and if you're new here, what we do on Unfortunate Ends is talk about people who have had tragic or unfortunate ends to their lives. Anyway, let's jump into today's video. On the 28th of March 1757, Robert-François Damiens became the last individual in France to ever suffer the horrendous death sentence of being hung, drawn and quartered. His crime was having attempted nearly 3 months earlier to stab the French king Louis XV to death at the royal palace of Versailles. But who was he, and why did he attempt to kill the King of France? Robert-François Damiens was born on the 9th of January 1715 in the village of La Toulouse in the north of France. He was the son of a gatekeeper and so would have come from a relatively impoverished background. It is little surprise then to find that he decided to join the French army at a young age, a common career path for those from disadvantaged backgrounds in 18th century Europe. As a result, he was most likely involved in the War of Austrian Succession, which was fought between an allegiance led by France and another headed by Britain and Austria between 1740 and 1748. We know little of Damiens' life, even while he was in the army and thereafter. He evidently was discharged or left the military at some point in the 1740s or early 1750s, and gravitated thereafter towards Paris, where he took up a number of different forms of employment. One of these was as a household servant in the Jesuit college in Paris, but there were evidently many other households he worked in. He moved around a lot, a possible consequence of being a serial thief from his employers, or of his being a mentally unstable individual. Yet by other accounts, he was a good servant, though one that was perhaps let go by several employers owing to his tendency to associate too closely with the female staff of the households that he worked in. The political and social environment of Paris in the mid-1750s, when Damiens would attempt to kill Louis XV, was particularly tense. Harvest failures and an economic downturn had created much unrest throughout France, in a country where many individuals were below the poverty line, and the monarchy ruled in an absolutist manner, with the close support of the French nobility and the Roman Catholic Church. Much of this unrest was centred on the Jansenist movement. Jansenism was a strain of Catholicism which flourished in France and parts of the Low Countries in the 17th and 18th centuries. Named after its founder, the 17th century Dutch theologian Cornelius Jansen, it emphasised a more austere form of Catholicism and rejected many of the more powerful institutions within the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. For poor and middle-class French people, embittered by the manner in which the French absolutist monarchy was propped up by the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy, Jansenism had a very strong appeal. But in an effort to crack down on its spread in France, a decision was taken by the authorities within the French Church in the mid-1750s to refuse henceforth to offer the sacraments at Mass and Church generally to anyone who professed an adherence to Jansenism. This had created enormous unrest in France and within Paris, and this would play a role in the Damiens affair, which unfolded early in 1757. Resentments about the harvest failures, economic crisis, and prohibition of the sacraments for Jansenists focused to a large extent on the French monarch. Louis XV had succeeded his great-grandfather, Louis XIV, in 1715, when the new king was just 5 years old. As a result, he did not begin to rule in his own right until well into the 1720s. Generally, Louis is understood to have been a very poor king, one who directed a costly and disastrous foreign policy. At home, his failure to reform French society and his naked corruption as a monarch created a great many problems which would eventually lead to the French Revolution in in 1789, and in the mid-1750s, he became a popular focus of resentment in France. It is still widely debated as to what Damiens' actual motive was in his assassination attempt. He later claimed that he had been upset by the unrest of the streets of Paris in 1756. However, he appears to have had few concrete ties to the Jansenists himself. Others have speculated that he was not sound of mind, and this, combined with the level of agitation which suffused French society at the time, drove him to his attempted regicide. Still, other scholars have speculated that he might have had no particular affiliation with any specific grouping, but was acting simply on behalf of the French people in trying to kill a king who had become a focus for discontent. Whatever his motives ultimately were, we do know the admittedly brief details of Damiens' unsuccessful attempt to kill the King of France. On the 5th of January 1757, he travelled to the French royal court at Versailles, about 20 kilometres outside the city of Paris. Versailles had developed into a minor town in its own right by this time. Such was the number of staff attendant on the royal court, and Damiens would have been able to avoid detection very easily. Then, at roughly 4 p.m. that evening, as Louis XV made for his carriage at the palace, Damiens rushed past the king's bodyguards and stabbed the king with a penknife. Yet, the wound was minor, and the king's rather thick clothing, worn against the cold January weather, protected him from anything beyond a minor gash. Damiens' rather botched assassination attempt had failed spectacularly. He made no effort to flee and was quickly arrested. In the aftermath of the incident, Paris was in a tumult. The Archbishop of Paris called for the reciting of prayers for the king for 40 hours straight. Louis XV was ordained in France as God's representative on earth, and as such, Damiens' crime was perceived as one of the greatest imaginable. His death would be vicious, but before it could occur, questions needed to be asked about what had motivated Damiens, and whether he had acted alone or as part of a wider conspiracy. Much of the questioning in the days and weeks that followed focused on the Jansenist controversy, which had been underway throughout the country, particularly in Paris. In the capital, the Parlement, the city's courts of justice, had effectively issued a decree stating that the refusal of the Catholic Church to provide the sacraments to Jansenists was not allowable in law. As such, they, as well as the Jansenist movement itself, now came under suspicion as possibly being accomplices of Damiens. For his part, Damiens was unclear about what he was doing on the 5th of January. At one point in his questioning, he insinuated that he was attempting to simply lay hands on the king and influence him, rather than actually kill the king. The idea here is that he was trying to deliver a message to the monarch from the French people that Louis needed to amend his ways. Eventually, Damiens' interrogators gave up, apparently satisfied that he had in fact acted alone. He was condemned as a regicide and was sentenced to be torn to pieces by horses in the Place de Grève, the name at the time for the Place de l'Hôtel de Ville in the 4th arrondissement in central Paris. This was a common site for public executions in early modern France. Damiens was now sentenced to be executed here on the 28th of March, 1757. On the morning of his execution, Damiens is alleged to have said, "The day will be hard," when the jailers entered his cell to begin his transit to the Place de Grève. The site of his execution was packed that day. An enormous crowd had gathered to see the death of the man who had attempted to kill the king. Such was the demand for a prime position that rooms in houses and apartments overlooking the Place de Grève had been rented out to the nobility for large sums of money, giving them a bird's eye view of the proceedings. This sinister fascination with seeing a man tortured to death, was not an entirely unusual development in early modern society, and public executions often drew crowds, though few on the scale of which arrived to the Place de Grève on the 28th of March 1757. What followed was gruesome. First, the hand that Damiens had used to hold the penknife with which he stabbed the king was burned with sulphur. Then, red-hot pincers were used to tear away at the flesh on his upper torso and arms. Molten wax, lead and boiling oils were poured into the wounds that developed. At one point in this ordeal, Damiens is reported to have cried out, "My God, give me strength, give me strength. Lord my God, have pity on me. Lord my God, I am suffering so much. Lord my God, give me patience." He was then hung, drawn and quartered. What this meant was that his 4 limbs were essentially tied to 4 horses, which were then encouraged to pull away from Damiens. With such executions, the merciful thing is if the horses managed to pull off the victim's limbs as quickly as possible. But reports of Damiens' execution indicate that his arms and legs were extremely durable. As a result, after an hour of being drawn by the horses, the executioners actually had to saw Damiens' limbs off to facilitate the process. The victim was still breathing when the 3 limbs had been pulled off. Eventually, when the quartering process had come to a brutal end, Damiens' torso was then thrown on a pyre and burned. Well, punishment for regicides in early modern Europe was extremely brutal. But it did not end there. In the aftermath of his death, Damiens' house was razed to the ground. His father and mother, as well as a daughter of Damiens, were banished from France. His siblings were allowed to remain, though they were forced to change their names. Yet, the crown had gone too far in its quest to create terror in the hearts of anyone who would attempt to kill a king. Having been vilified in the immediate aftermath of his assassination attempt, in the weeks that followed his actual execution, Damiens garnered a good deal of sympathy in death, owing to the gruesome nature of his execution. That trend has continued down to the present day. Since his death, Damiens has acquired a certain celebrity status, though one he himself would undoubtedly have wished to avoid, as it centered almost entirely on the gruesome death and nature of his execution. For instance, French literary figures, as prominent as Voltaire, discussed the Damiens affair in the 1770s and the 1780s as a mean of criticizing the French monarchy. The great liberal political thinker, Thomas Paine, in his Rights of Man, published in 1791, cited Damiens' death as an example of the abuse of power by tyrannous absolutist monarchs. Nearly a century after his death, Charles Dickens read about Damiens in his youth, while Mark Twain wrote about him in A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, published in 1889. More recently, one of the foremost scholars of the 20th century, Michel Foucault, discussed Damiens in the introduction to one of his most significant works, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. Thus, while Damiens' effort to kill Louis XV was entirely botched, and the very reasons why he did it remain unclear, the grotesque manner in which he was executed have had a far greater relevance in discussion of the abuse of absolute power by the state and how punishment is handed out by governments. That is the real legacy of the Damiens affair. Thank you so much for watching this video on Robert-François Damiens. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave me a like and a comment down below. And if you're new, why not subscribe? If you have any unfortunate ends you'd like to recommend, you can leave them in the comments, or you can find my Instagram and email in the description. I hope you guys have notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as they're uploaded. And anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next unfortunate ends. Thanks!